Hey guys. So right now in this lesson, we're going to be talking about how the concept of resuscitation affects the afterlife. So to kind of be able to properly explain this one, we're going to have to talk about what the afterlife is normally like for us as Christians. So where do believers go? Where do unbelievers go? What will happen at the end of history before the resurrection? Things like this. So we kind of have a lot of stuff to get out of the way first before we can sort of properly address the question as such. So first, we're going to talk about the nature and composition of human beings, how we are made of body and spirit, and what that means exactly. We're going to talk about types of death. So there is physical death, there is spiritual death, which is separation from God, and then there is eternal death, also sometimes called the second death. And specifically here, we're going to be talking about physical death. And then we're going to be defining what exactly that means. And so physical death is when someone's human spirit departs their physical body. And then what happens after someone dies physically? Well, we have to spend some time talking about where people go after they die. And so to do that, we're going to have to talk about so-called heavenly geography here. So the third heaven versus Hades versus this world, and there's some subdivisions in what we term Hades, also known as Sheol or the grave. So Abraham's bosom or paradise, torments, the abyss, the lake of fire. We're going to be going over some terms like this. And then we're going to talk about how things are a little bit different before Christ ascends, which is described in Hebrews chapter 4, verses 7 through 10, and how things change after that. And then we're also going to talk about, well, where are we going to be in eternity? All of this describes, quote unquote, where people go when they die. And so this is all like the normal thing, how things work for people who die normally, and there is no resuscitation that's a part of their afterlife experience. And before we can even get to that, we also still have to talk about how people experience these places before the resurrection. So we're going to introduce something called interim bodies, a teaching that holds that even before the resurrection, human beings that have died are not just floating around disembodied as spirits, but have these temporary interim bodies until they receive their resurrection bodies, like 1 Corinthians chapter 15 talks about. And so that will all describe how life after death works in the case that there is no resuscitation. And so that's kind of like all that to lead up to that. And then finally, we're just going to have one slide actually that's going to talk about, well, what about people who are resuscitated? What is different for them? And we're basically going to argue that, well, nothing is really different for them other than they go backwards once rather than everyone else who only goes forwards in this the state transition, if you will. And so that is what we're going to be examining here in this lesson. So first of all, kind of restating this question of what we're kind of setting out to address. We are going to be talking here about how the concept of resuscitation affects the afterlife, or the experience that we as believers might have after we die. And so the idea is kind of like, where did Lazarus and Jairus' daughter go when they died, considering they were resuscitated and not resurrected, like we will be at the end of history? But they also kind of did have the normal afterlife experience. And so we're going to be talking about, well, are things different for people who were resuscitated like this? Like, where did they go in between when they were dead physically and then they came back to life? Like, what happened there? And so to do all of that, like we just went over in the outline, we have to kind of do a lot of things first before we can get there to talk about that situation specifically. So as you can see, lots of text on this slide. This is the first of the background topics we kind of have to talk about to be able to properly discuss the matters at play here. So we're going to be talking about the nature and composition of human beings. So human beings are what we are going to term dichotomous. That is, they are composed of two distinct parts, emphasis on two rather than, for example, one or three. And so those two parts that compose human beings are body and spirit. There is no third thing, and so you might hear that termed in Latin tertium quid. It's just a Latin for third thing. But you know, that has been used in philosophical discussions about such things. So there is no third thing. It is just body and spirit. But I should say that this point is actually pretty widely misunderstood because a lot of people think that there is another thing, and we would call that soul. People think that it's body, spirit, and soul, not just body and spirit. But biblically speaking, we don't have souls, we are souls. And so that is to say, a soul is the combination of body and spirit together that makes us us. And so the word that we translate as soul in Hebrew is nephesh, and in Greek it is psyche. And so you might compare the English word psyche there, which is actually basically a transliteration of that Greek word. And so both of these languages have, these other words that we translate, or rather that the translators, the Bible versions, often translate as soul, but it's actually not the only thing that those words can mean. And so, as I say, because I think there's kind of a lot of misunderstanding on this particular point, especially over all the centuries that people have written about this, I'm not the biggest fan of translating these Greek and Hebrew words with the word soul, just because of all the connotative baggage that that term has picked up over time. So these two Greek and Hebrew words, so nephesh in Hebrew and psyche in Greek, can be better translated, in my opinion, as appropriate based on context. So you kind of have to make sure you're picking an appropriate word in whatever circumstances you need to translate with these other words. So like I said, these words in Greek and Hebrew can also be translated as heart or mind or person or life in the sense of a human life or a living being. And so all of these things, now if you think about it for a sec, you will notice that when you think about exactly what the definition of soul is in English, you can kind of see how these other things become equivalent to it in the circumstances in which we use them. And so in our particular discussion here, you might think of hearing something like, when the ship went down, 200 souls were lost. And so what someone means if they say something like that unfortunate occurrence would be that 200 human beings or living persons drowned when the ship, crashed or capsized or whatever. And then you could also think of a statement like, he felt the sting of her words deep down in his soul. Couldn't we replace soul with heart there and have exactly the same sense? And so you can kind of see how you can substitute these other words for circumstances in which we would use this word in English, and you don't lose meaning. But those are both mapping back to these same words in Hebrew and Greek. So nephesh and psyche that we translate as soul, you can also translate with these other words. And so the core point that we are making here is that actually humans are only made up of these two things. We're made up of body and spirit, and there is no third thing. There is no tertium quid. We are dichotomous, not trichotomous. And so we only have body and spirit, not body, spirit, and soul. And so we have to do a little bit of thinking when we translate here to make sure we're using the right word. So for example, if we're referring to a life as in, a human life, or we are referring to something going on, the battle for human hearts and minds, you could say the battle for human souls. So you kind of have to figure out, what's the appropriate word to replace it with in translation. But the reason why we might want to avoid using the word soul when we translate is because of all of the connotative baggage that word has. People tend to think that soul is something different than body and spirit, that it's some third thing that we are made up of, when that's just not the case. And so to kind of sidestep problems there, in my opinion and in the opinion of other people, I'm not the only one who feels this way, it kind of makes sense to avoid using it, just because it kind of makes things unclear or ambiguous, because different people use the word differently. And so it's not wrong, like, as I say, if we understand properly that souls are the composition of body and spirit together, the thing that makes us us. We have this battle going on in our hearts and our minds, like Galatians chapter 5 talks about. Well, that is our soul. That is who we are. So if you understand that definition, it's not like it's a bad word or anything. It's just that a lot of people take it to mean different things. And so it can be kind of unclear if we use it exactly what we mean by it. And so for that reason, kind of makes sense when we're having these conversations about what human beings are composed of to only stick with flesh and spirit. And just if we need to translate these words from Greek or Hebrew, nephesh or psyche, to use heart or mind or person or life, or one of these other translations, just so that it doesn't trip other people up. All right, so that was the first of the background topics we need to cover. Next, we're going to be talking about types of death. So there are actually three types of death that human beings can experience. And so we would say that when we think of death as a concept, we can actually kind of be referring to different things here. So first of all, there is physical death. Then there's spiritual death, which by that we would mean spiritual separation from God. And then finally, there's eternal death, which you might also hear called the second death. And that is spending eternity in the lake of fire, eternally separated from God. And so this is not what we want to experience. And believers do not face this. This is the fate of unbelievers, of those who are unwilling to submit to God. And so a passage that is kind of related to this distinctions between death concept, if you will, is Genesis chapter 3, verse 4, when Satan told Eve that she would surely not die if she ate of the fruit. And so when he said that, he spoke a half-truth. While disobeying God did not cause immediate physical death for Adam and Eve, and so this would kind of be Satan's half-truth here, is that when Eve ate of the fruit, she didn't immediately keel over dead. So she did not die physically instantaneously. But nonetheless, this action caused immediate spiritual death, that spiritual separation from God. Adam and Eve hid from the Lord God. Once they'd eaten of the fruit, they knew they were naked. It caused this barrier of separation between man and God that was not previously there. That's spiritual death. And in fact, eating of this fruit would cause eventual physical death, even if not instantaneously. So because of this, Adam and Eve would die eventually. Previously, they were immortal, they were undying, they did not experience death in any sense of the word. But now, because of this, they were separated from God, they faced spiritual death, and now they would eventually face physical death as well. And even more than that, if God had not provided a gracious means of escape for us in the blood of Jesus Christ, which is actually symbolized and foreshadowed in Genesis chapter 3, verse 21, when God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife. That is, animals were killed, their blood was shed to clothe Adam and Eve. This is often called the proto-evangelium, or first gospel. This represents, symbolizes, and foreshadows the blood of Christ covering us and reconciling us to God. All the way back in the very beginning of the Bible, in Genesis chapter 3, we already see God's redemptive plan for humanity being played out. And of course, that comes up in the prophecy just a few verses before this as well. But in any case, if God hadn't clothed us in the blood of Jesus Christ, all of us, Adam and Eve included, would necessarily face certain eternal death from God as well. Or sorry, eternal death, separation from God as well. So that is, being separated from God in the lake of fire for all eternity. A horrible fate that would be where we would all end up if God hadn't, out of his grace and mercy, sent Jesus Christ to die for us. So these are the three types of death. Now, in our present study, where we're talking about the idea of the afterlife and how resuscitation might be related to it, we're going to be focusing on the first type of death specifically, and so that is physical death. And so if we say we're going to be focusing on physical death here, well, that kind of means we should define the term. What does physical death mean exactly? And so we're going to be saying that physical death means that someone's human spirit departs their physical body. And so we would actually probably term this that someone dies when they cease breathing. Now, the reason why this association is kind of the right way to think about it, it's good and proper for us to say this, is because the words in both Hebrew and Greek for breath and spirit are the same word. That is, this Hebrew word here, ruach, and this Greek word, pneuma, these both mean both breath and spirit. The same word is used for both concepts. And so that's why this is how we should talk about it. It's how the Bible talks about it, just implicitly through the languages. The human spirit, again, spirit being defined by these words, is present when breath is present and not when not. And so we don't need to go get down on, I don't know, all the specifics of, well, what happens if someone's heart stops beating because they have a heart attack but then they come back a couple minutes later. The point here is that the association between these words is such that breath and life are very closely related linguistically speaking. And so in their languages, these words are related. So jumping down a little bit, this paragraph here, this is actually also true in Latin. So the word for spirit and breath in Latin is spiritus. And so that is a third language here where you can kind of clearly see this association. It's not all languages, though, interestingly. So German has two separate words for spirit and breath, Geist and Atem. And we have two separate words in English, too. That is spirit and breath, right? We don't use the same word for both of them. But you can see here in Hebrew and Greek and Latin, there is this association between breathing and having a spirit that is being physically alive. Because when people die, their spirit leaves their physical body alongside their breath. They no longer breathe, they're no longer alive. And so this identical duality in meaning, the fact that it's there in both Greek and Hebrew, and actually Latin and some other languages as well, this is actually kind of noteworthy because Hebrew and Greek are not related linguistically speaking. So Greek and Latin are, both Greek and Latin are what are known as Indo-European languages. They kind of share a family tree, if you will. But Hebrew is not, completely different language tree. Hebrew is a Semitic language. And so the fact that both of these languages have this same exact concept kind of points to a universal spiritual truth. That is, this is the way the world is. This is a spiritual reality because all these languages have this same concept. And so this is kind of similar to this other video in this series here talking about death and sleep. It's another case where that association crosses languages. Well, so too here with this idea of breath and spirit being one and the same thing. So all that technical discussion aside, the key takeaway point here is that physical death is the removal of someone's human spirit from their physical body. And if you remember, just before, we had talked about how human beings are composed of body and spirit. And so physical death is when a human being has their spirit separated from their physical body. So their physical body is buried. It is no longer animated, if you will, by their spirit. So maybe that can be confusing. It's maybe why we don't always use that language when we explain this. But the idea is that physical death means that someone's human spirit has been separated from their body. All right, so that kind of lays the groundwork we need to start talking about exactly what happens after someone dies. And so before we could even get there, we have to talk about, well, first of all, what is dying? What is physical death? And to properly explain that physical death is the removal of the human spirit from the body, we had to talk about, well, humans are made up of body and spirit, right? Because that's related. And we also had to talk about how there's different types of death, and physical death specifically is the one we're talking about. So after all of that, we kind of get here where we're ready to start addressing the main thrust of the question, that what happens after someone dies, and is it different in the case of a person who will be resuscitated? And so the procedure I'm going to use here to explain this is first we're going to kind of talk about the quote-unquote normal case. So for someone who will not be resuscitated, what does their path to the afterlife look like? And then we're going to circle back at the very end and talk about, well, are things different or are they the same for a person who will be resuscitated? Now, before we can get too far here, we actually have to make another point, and that is that what happens after you die actually isn't the same across all of human history. And so there are sort of three states here that we're going to be talking about. There is before Christ's ascension, after Christ's ascension, and in eternity proper. So where you go when you die has not been constant throughout human history. And how and where we will spend eternity with God in the new heavens and new earth is yet again different from both states that believers have when they die before eternity. So eternity proper, that is new heavens and new earth, will be yet a third possible state that people will experience after they die relative to what happens after they die before Christ's ascension and after Christ's ascension and then after the resurrection. All three of these are different. And so some of these topics are a bit tangential to this present matter, so I'm really not going to spend too much time here. Like, we could probably make a video on each, honestly speaking, but we're just going to kind of try to summarize the basics of these concepts just so that we can explain, well, what does the afterlife experience look like in the normal case? Because we kind of have to talk about this to be able to talk about what happens after you die in a general sense. Well, if you don't know where people go or what it's like, you have a hard time explaining what the afterlife is like, right? So we kind of have to delve into a bit of this, but we're not going to get super off in the weeds on some of the technical details. So in this section, I'm not so much going to be establishing this with, I don't know, scholarly arguments and lots of verse references and stuff. I'm just going to be kind of saying this is how it is. And I'm not going to try to prove it so much other than saying, well, in my understanding and reading of scripture and the Bible's evidence, this is what the afterlife is like. And so we're just going to kind of assert it in summary form here. And then we're going to describe what happens when people die and what their experience in the afterlife is after we've gone through and summarized some of these topics here. All right, so this slide, look, a picture. It's not just text this time. The first thing we're going to talk about is sort of answering the where question. So where do people go when they die? And to answer that, we're going to kind of look at what can be termed, quote unquote, heavenly geography here. And so starting at the top, not that it's like necessarily two-dimensional, but, conceptually speaking, we're going to start with the third heaven. So this is where the throne room of God the Father is. And we're going to talk about all this in the next slide here. So I'll, switch back and forth. But the third heaven is separated from this present universe by a barrier that we're going to call the waters above. So when Genesis, the creation account, talks about separating the waters above and the waters below, I don't know if you've ever heard of that or if that sounds familiar, it actually has a purpose more than just, I don't know, that land came out of water in the creation account. Like, it is talking about this ontological reality of how the universe is constructed, of how, God is separate from our present physical creation, ever more important after the presence of sin in this world. But there is a separating barrier between the third heaven and this present world, this cosmos, under the control of Satan and ruled by sin in our present times. And so there's that separating barrier. And then within this cosmos, we have the heavens and the earth. Now, heavens is actually plural in Hebrew. So it's not, we might say, in English, we might say the sky. And the sky, we would typically mean like the atmosphere. But if you say night sky, you're usually not just talking about like, I don't know, like the stratosphere around Earth, but also stars in the universe, right? So kind of same concept in Hebrew. Shemayim is plural, and it is talking about kind of Earth's atmosphere, like clouds and whatnot, and also the universe beyond. And then Earth is our planet. And so this is this world, this cosmos that we presently inhabit. And then there's another barrier separating this present world, this creation, from what we're going to term Hades. And so kind of explaining some of this more, you may also hear Hades termed Sheol or the grave. These are all descriptions of the same place that in terms of heavenly geography is separate from the third heaven and separate from earth. And all of these are separated by these barriers, the so-called waters above and waters below. So on those separating waters, there's a couple of verses in Revelation that talk about a sea of glass. So Revelation chapter 4, verse 6 says, "Before the throne there was something like a sea of glass, like crystal, and in the center and around the throne 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and behind." So Revelation chapter 4, verse 6 mentions the sea of glass, and also Revelation chapter 15, verse 2, again describing what it's like in the third heaven. "And I saw something like a sea of glass mixed with fire, and those who had been victorious over the beast in his image, and the number of his name standing on the sea of glass holding harps of God. So from here, this sea of glass, this is what we're talking about with this separating barrier between the third heaven and this present cosmos. These barriers divide the heavenly geography, if you will, into three distinct categories. The third heaven, this cosmos, the devil's world, which is composed of the heavens and the earth, and then Hades, or what we would also, you might also hear it just termed the underworld generally. That's a staple in mythological systems, but Hades or Sheol or the grave is the third division. So as kind of mentioned a little bit before, the third heaven is where the Father currently resides, separated from the world due to the tainting presence of sin in this current creation. So this will no longer be the case. That is, the Father will no longer be separated from us, but will actually dwell alongside us when this current creation is destroyed and replaced with the new heavens and the new earth at the end of history. And so that is, take this middle section here, this present cosmos, the devil's world, we would say, under the control of Satan. You can contrast Ephesians chapter 2, the prince of the power of the air. Satan is temporarily in control of the world, not because he won a battle or something, but because God has let him for the purpose of testing humanity. Well, this present heavens and earth will be destroyed. We'll go over that a bit later. Rolled up like a scroll, replaced with the new heavens and the new earth, which won't have sin anymore. And at that point in time, God the Father will dwell alongside us and elect angels, and we'll all have perfect fellowship with each other in eternity. But this middle part will get replaced, is what I'm saying. But in the meantime, the Father is separate from this present world due to the tainting presence of sin. And so the cosmos, this present world, is composed of earth and the Shemayim, mentioned this before, plural heavens, referring to Earth's atmosphere in the wider universe. And so this is where we currently dwell. This is what we would call space-time in the universe. And so we are here for a finite amount of time until we die, until we go meet our maker, we face judgment. This is where human beings are tested. Will we believe in God? Will we choose to follow him in this world controlled by Satan? Will we make the right choices? This period of testing occurs in the cosmos. As I said, right now under the temporary control of Satan because God has let him usurp control for the purpose of testing humanity. And then finally, this third segment here, Hades or Sheol or the grave or the underworld. Well, this third place is actually composed of some further subdivisions. So not on this picture here, and as said, I'm not like doing the full accounting of these things, giving you all the scripture that supports all this or all of the logical argumentation to lay all this out. I'm just kind of summarizing what I hold to be the truth about the organization of the underworld and, like where people go when they die and things like that. So not that I'm being, kind of hand wavy here. I do believe all this. I think there is evidence for this, but just kind of going through the summary version, like I said. So for Hades, the further subdivision that are part of this, one is sometimes known as Abraham's bosom or paradise. So this is the quote-unquote good part of Hades, and this is where pre-cross believers used to be located. And so we'll talk more about what that used to be means in a moment here. And then there is torments, which is the quote-unquote bad part of Hades, where unbelievers go to await the great white throne judgment at the end of history. And so so-called great white throne judgment, well, this is the judgment of unbelievers. So there is a judgment at the end of the tribulation when Christ returns, the church is resurrected. That's when 1 Corinthians chapter 15 happens. And then at the end of human history, right before the heavens and the earth are remade, there's this judgment where unbelievers go before the great white throne to be judged for their works. Now, they're not sent to hell because of their sin. They're sent to hell because of their rejection of Jesus Christ. Jesus paid for all human sin on the cross. So people don't go to hell because of sin. People go to hell because of unbelief. And so at any rate, torments is where unbelievers go to await this final judgment, so-called great white throne judgment. And so it's a subdivision of Hades. It's not the same as Abraham's bosom or paradise, which is the good part. This is where unbelievers go. And there's actually another place so-called the abyss or Tartarus. That might sound familiar if you know Greek mythology, but don't import all the associations there. It's not the same, right? It's not like the Bible stole this thing from Greek mythology. It's just a word in Greek, right? Um, and so the abyss is where certain fallen angels are currently incarcerated on account of transgressing God's limitations put on them. So a couple of verses here. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 4 says, if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment. That's what we're talking about here, the abyss. Now, keep in mind, angels are creatures of light. Casting them into the pit of eternal darkness, not going to do good things to creatures of light, right? And then also Jude chapter 1, verse 6 here, and angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, he has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of that great day. Referring to the same thing as that passage from 2 Peter. Now, this is actually, not to get off topic, this is referring to angels breeding with human women in Genesis chapter 6. There's these people called the Nephilim who were half angel. And so, that is a kind of a controversial thing. We're not going to get into that here, but that is the sin of these angels for which they were incarcerated. Not allowed to mess with humans like that. And so God chains them in the abyss. 2 Peter 2:4, Jude 1, verse 6. Now, lake of fire, also a subdivision of Hades. Now, this is where all unbelieving humans and angels will be cast for all eternity, although it is presently uninhabited and will remain as such until that future point of irreversible judgment. Judgment before the great white throne is when unbelievers are condemned to the lake of fire alongside Satan and all the fallen angels. And so, have you been following along with all this? You might wonder, well, where's hell fit into this? That is typically what we refer to as, quote unquote, the place where unbelievers go when they die. Well, what do we mean by that? And we are actually kind of loose with how we use this in English. So in practice, sometimes people mean by it torments. So this part of Hades where unbelievers go to await the great white throne judgment. And then, we also refer to it, like as meaning like the final resting place of unbelievers. Like unbelievers go to hell for all time. Well, in that sense, if we use it in that way, we're actually kind of talking about the lake of fire. And those are actually, technically speaking, two distinct places, neither of them pleasant, both of them separated from God, but not quite the same place in terms of heavenly geography. So I'm sure this was a lot of information. Kind of had to get through this, like I said, just to talk about, well, where do people go when they die? There's all these subdivisions, and what is heavenly geography like, and what's the difference between this present cosmos and Hades, which is where people go when they die, and the third heaven, which is where believers are currently, which we'll get to in a sec. Well, what's the difference between all these? That's kind of what we've been talking about here. All right, so we kind of hinted at this in our discussion of all of the places where people can end up after they die, but things actually changed after Christ's ascension. And so in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 7 through 10, it describes, Christ leading captivity captive. That is one way you may hear this phrase. Now, this link here is actually to a study in the systematic theology that my mentor has written about Jesus Christ. So this is so-called Christology. A section of that study talks about the transfer of believers from the subterranean paradise to the third heaven. That is from Abraham's bosom or paradise in Hades to the third heaven with the Father. So in our picture, they went from somewhere down here in the good part of Hades to the third heaven. And this happened after Jesus ascended. And so this is why we say things are different before and after Christ's ascension. And so for pre-cross believers, when they died, they went to Abraham's bosom in Hades, or the good part, paradise in Hades. So in the underworld, Sheol, the grave, whatever you want to call it, this part of heavenly geography that is separated by the waters below. So not part of this universe, but separate, but also not in the presence of the Father, which is where the third heaven is. So this is where Lazarus and Abraham are in Luke chapter 16. So with the parable of Lazarus and Abraham and the rich man, Lazarus and Abraham are in this place that we would call Abraham's bosom. And in fact, that's where we get this term from. Lazarus is said to be kind of by Abraham's side in Abraham's bosom, right next to him, in paradise in Hades. And so as we mentioned before, Hades contains multiple subdivisions, all these in fact, right? Paradise, torments, the abyss, the lake of fire. Well, this other place called torments, this is where the rich man was in that parable. And so that is where unbelieving humans go after death to await the final judgment, that great white throne judgment. And so these two sections, that is Abraham's bosom or paradise and torments, are separated by a great chasm such that nobody can cross between the two sections. And so this is what Luke chapter 16, verse 26 is getting at. Luke 16:26 says, "Between us and you there is a great chasm fixed, so that those who wish to come over from here to you will not be able, and that none may cross over from there to us." And so there's this big division between Abraham's bosom and torments. Because unbelievers get sent to torments, they can't go to paradise. They are fixed, they are bound, and they will be there until Judgment Day. And so too for believers, they do not go to torments, they go to Abraham's bosom. And these are two separate places and there's boundaries between them. That's what Luke chapter 16, verse 26 is getting at. Now, we should say in all this that Abraham's bosom, which is where pre-cross believers went to, or rather like pre-ascension believers went to, well, Abraham's bosom, even though it's separate from the presence of the Father, because the Father is in the third heaven, like we said, Hades is not the third heaven, and Abraham's bosom is a subdivision of Hades. Well, even though Abraham's bosom is separate from the presence of Father, this was not some neutral or negative holding space or prison. So like purgatory, not that we're going to go there. It's not like neutral or even bad. This was a form of paradise. It is not the same as the third heaven, and it's not the same as the new heavens and the new earth where we will live with God for all eternity, like a final paradise, if you will. And it's also not the same as initial paradise, i.e. the Garden of Eden, but it is a form of paradise, right? A good place to be. This is where believers went before Christ's ascension. All right, so that was before Christ's ascension. Now we're going to talk about where believers went after Christ's ascension. So again, as described in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 7 through 10, all of those who were previously in Abraham's bosom were led by Christ into the presence of the Father in the third heaven. And so we would say that this is the victory that Christ won for us on the cross. The veil of separation between us and God was completely and utterly split. We are no longer separate from God. The veil has been torn in two. And so we are able to be in the presence of the Father because he sees us through the blood of Christ. When the Father accepted Christ's payment for our sins, death was defeated, and God now only sees believing humans through the blood of Christ. And for this reason, since then, when believers die, they join all of our previously departed brothers and sisters in the third heaven, where our ancient forebears were led after Christ's ascension. So after Christ ascends, he takes his seat at the right hand of God the Father in the third heaven. Believing humans up to that point were transferred to the presence of the third heaven, because now, after Christ's sacrifice had been rendered, God sees us only through the blood of Christ. So that's the change. That's why they are now allowed into the presence of the Father, because they are covered in the blood of Christ. Positionally, they had been saved before on credit, so to speak, because Christ paid for all human sin upon the cross. It wasn't like their sin before was somehow like not punished. There's this verse in Hebrews 3:25 that says God passed over the sins previously committed. So Old Testament believers, before Christ's payment for our sin on the cross and his resurrection and ascension, they were saved on credit, so to speak, because it was the blood of Christ that sacrificed, that he died for us on the cross and was judged in our place for human sin. That's what saves everybody, past, present, and future. And so Old Testament believers positionally saved on credit here. But because the Father now sees believers, through the blood of Christ, that's why we are able to be in the third heaven, and that's why they weren't able to be in the third heaven before. And so this is the change that happened after Christ's ascension, as described in Hebrews chapter 4, verses 7 through 10. Now, in this, unbelievers didn't change. Unbelievers still go to torments in Hades to await the great white throne judgment. That part stayed consistent. It's just that pre-ascension, believers went to Abraham's bosom in Hades, and post-Christ ascension, believers go straight to the third heaven in the presence of the Father. That is the thing that changed after Christ ascended. Now, if that wasn't already enough for you, we're going to talk about eternity proper now as well. And so there is described in Revelation a period of 1,000 literal years known as the millennium, wherein Christ will rule from Jerusalem in this present creation. So not new heavens and new earth, but in this present creation, the returned Christ, he's coming with the crown this time, not the suffering servant. He will rule from Jerusalem in this present creation, and it will be a time of overflowing peace and prosperity like no other time before. Now, I should say that I am stating this as fact, and I believe it is true. Plenty of people disagree on this period known as the millennium. There is a form of end times interpretation called amillennialism that doesn't believe in millennium at all. And so we're not going to get into that here. Just thought I should mention it, that I am taking a position here. But in the millennium, literal 1,000 years under my interpretation, and what I would say the Bible actually says, because that's what Revelation says, Christ will rule from this present creation. But eternity proper is actually different from the millennium because it's a new creation, new heavens and new earth. So at the end of history, this current creation will be destroyed. So I have a lot of verse references here. I'm not going to read all of them, but this creation will be replaced. New heavens and new earth. One of these verses talks about the earth being rolled up like a scroll. Yeah, here it is, Isaiah chapter 34, verse 4. The host of heaven will wear away, and the sky will be rolled up like a scroll. So this present creation will be destroyed, and then God will make the new heavens and the new earth. The new Jerusalem will descend from the sky, and we will dwell there in perfect bliss for all eternity. No more tears, no more pain, and perfect fellowship, not only with each other, but also elect angels and God. God's entire family, those who have chosen for him in this life, will all have perfect fellowship in the new heavens and the new earth, in the new Jerusalem, living with the Father. And so that is the eternal state of believers and elect angels. By way of contrast, unbelievers will find themselves thrown into the lake of fire for all eternity, alongside Satan and the other fallen angels. So lake of fire, one of those subdivisions of Hades we talked about. This is where people, unbelievers, will end up in final judgment for all of eternity. So as you can see, this question of, well, where do you go when you die? Well, are you talking about before Christ's ascension, after Christ's ascension, or after eternity here? Where will we be in, the end state of things? Well, all those are different. And so that's why this question is kind of hard to answer just like simply or shortly. That's why kind of we've gone through this general state of, well, where are the possible places you could go? And when do you go to them? Like, what divisions of history were people going to these places, and based on what events? So that's what we've talked about here. Obviously, a lot of information, but the point is that when you die, when people have died throughout history, believers would have either ended up in Abraham's bosom before Christ's ascension, or in the third heaven in the presence of the Father after Christ's ascension. And then in eternity, we will be dwelling with God on the new heavens and the new earth in the new Jerusalem, as described in the book of Revelation. But that won't happen until the end of human history, after this present universe that's infested with sin is destroyed completely and God makes the new heavens and the new earth. Okay, now before we can get to actually answering that question of, well, what happens after you die, we still have yet another facet to talk about. And that is kind of, in what form do we exist as, I don't know, like beings after we die? Like, are we just spirits floating about, or do we have physicality? And so this is going to be the last general information topic, I promise, before we actually get to answering the main question. And so Unfortunately, we have a lot of explaining to do here too, but this is the last background thing that will help us explain exactly what the afterlife is like. And so, unfortunately, a lot of pop culture representations of heaven involve like pearly gates, clouds, floating gold streets, and things like that. Things that make it seem somehow floaty and ephemeral and almost not real, rather than something that's physical. And this isn't at all compatible with the Bible's descriptions of the afterlife. There is physicality there, especially new heavens and new earth. This one people get very wrong, because in eternity, we won't be walking around up in the sky somewhere. We will be on the new earth, in the new Jerusalem, like ground, not sky. It is completely different. And so this is just, you have to be careful about what, I don't know, like connotations heaven might pull up for you, because a lot of what people think heaven is, it's not really there. Like another one, humans do not have wings in heaven. That's not a thing. You don't earn your wings. Humans do not become angels either. So all sorts of problematic, I don't know, teaching that you can pick up from popular representations of this that don't have their grounding in the Bible. So all that aside, unlike what some people think, heaven is not floaty and ephemeral. It is physical. It has physicality. And so the Bible is real clear that in final resurrection, we will be quote unquote like Christ. So that's a direct quote here from 1 John chapter 3, verse 2. Says, "Beloved, now we are children of God, and it has not appeared as yet what we will be. We know that when he appears, we will be like him, because we will see him just as he is." So we will be like Christ. We will have resurrection bodies just how Christ did. And then there's this other passage here in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Now, some folks might just know off the top of their heads, 1 Corinthians 15, one of the biggest passages in the Bible talking about resurrection. And so we're going to go ahead and read this whole thing, and it's a few paragraphs here. So it is just really important for talking about the resurrection, for talking about what bodies we will have and what our state will be like in the resurrection state. Not in temporary bodies, as we're about to talk about, not in Abraham's bosom, not in the third heaven, but once believers are resurrected, what happens? So, talking about the revelation, picking up in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 35, Paul says, "But someone will say, 'How are the dead raised? And with what kind of body do they come?' You fool, that which you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And that which you sow, you do not sow the body which is to be, but a bare grain, perhaps of wheat or of something else. But God gives it a body just as he wished, and to each of the seeds a body of its own. All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one flesh of men, and another flesh of beast, and another flesh of birds, and another of fish. There are also heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly is one, and the glory of the earthly is another. There is one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars. For star differs from star in glory. So also is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown a perishable body, it is raised an imperishable body. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. So it is also written, the first man, Adam, became a living soul. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. So just pausing there, that's verse 45, 1 Corinthians 15:45. The last Adam is referring to Jesus Christ. So Adam became a living soul. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. That is what Christ did for us. So picking up at verse 46. However, the spiritual is not first, but the natural, then the spiritual. The first man is from the earth, earthy. The second man, again, Jesus Christ here, the second man is from heaven. As is the earthy, so also are those who are earthy, and as is the heavenly, so also are those who are heavenly. Just as we have borne the image of the earthy, we will also bear the image of the heavenly. Now I say this, brethren, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For this perishable must put on the imperishable, and this mortal must put on immortality. But when this perishable will have to put on the imperishable, and this mortal will have to put on immortality, then will come about the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your toil is not in vain in the Lord. So, don't know exactly how long I read that for, probably a few minutes there, but 1 Corinthians 15, picking up at verse 35, very important discussion in the Bible about resurrection. And so, I obviously don't have enough time to unpack all of this. I just wanted to give us the full context, actually read that chapter, because it is critical to us understanding the difference between the bodies that we have here on earth as humans versus the bodies we will have in resurrection. So we obviously see that in both these cases we have bodies. So verse 44, it's sown a natural body and raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. Direct quote from the Bible, there is a body for us in eternity. We will not be disembodied. And so to pull us back to our discussion here on the slide, we know that in final resurrection, we will have a body just how Christ had a body. And so we will be living in the new heavens and the new earth, not up in the clouds somewhere, like we were talking about. We will have bodies that are incorruptible, spiritual bodies, as Paul puts it, that will be ruled over by spiritual impulses rather than the sinful fleshly ones like we have at present. Now, we can only kind of grasp the barest outlines of exactly what this means, but the key point is that our spirits will still be housed in bodies, even if they are different than the ones we are now in. And obviously, as this passage shows, they will be different. They are heavenly, because as is the earthy, so also those who are earthy, and as is the heavenly, so also those who are heavenly. We will bear the image of the heavenly when we are resurrected. So the question in all of this was, if that's the resurrection state, and right now we are in the earthy state, we are in these bodies presently corrupted and infested with sin and fleshly desire. Well, what about before the resurrection? We said the resurrection doesn't happen until, Jesus returns at the end of the tribulation. This is before the millennium. That's when believers are resurrected. That judgment of believers happens, which is separate from the great white throne judgment. So kind of confusing. Apologies about that. But before that resurrection, what were people like? Did they have bodies then? Because the bodies we talked about just there in 1 Corinthians 15, those are resurrection bodies. And the bodies we have now are fleshly, earthly bodies. So what about in between? Did the people in Abraham's bosom have bodies of some form? What about those in the third heaven now? So the place where people were led after Christ's ascension. So to answer that question we just raised here, that is, do people in Abraham's bosom have bodies, and so too people in the third heaven? The answer to that question, we're going to argue, is yes. People in the afterlife, even before the resurrection, as discussed in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, have bodies too. And so you'll recall at the beginning of today's lesson, we talked about the nature and composition of human beings. We said human beings have body and spirit. We are dichotomous. And so back in what we're talking about here, all the way here where we are, the answer to do we have bodies in the afterlife is yes, because human beings have bodies. That is, ontologically speaking, that's simply how God has made us. We aren't human if we are just spirit, because humans are composed of body and spirit. And so how could we only exist as spirit if that's not how God has made us, if that's not our nature? So that's the general argument here. And as the Bible talks about it, this concept of human spirits being joined with physical bodies is typically spoken of metaphorically in terms of clothing. So a spirit puts on a body, so to speak. There's several passages that we're going to look at here. So one of these is 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. So 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 through 4 says, "For we know that if the earthly tent, which is our house, is torn down, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For indeed, in this house we groan, longing to be clothed, and note the clothing metaphor here, longing to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven. Inasmuch as we, having put it off, I'm going to come back to why I translated that as off, not on. It's important. Having put it off, will not be found naked. For indeed, while we are in this tent, we groan, being burdened, because we do not want to be unclothed, but to be clothed, so that what is mortal will be swallowed up by life. So again, this verse 3 here, not going to actually spend too much time because we don't have time in the video, but there is a textual problem here. This needs to be translated as off, not on. I'll talk more about that when we get there. I think it's maybe a minute from now or whatever. But this passage here, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 through 4, talks about the earthly tent versus the heavenly tent, and talks about this idea of being clothed versus naked. And that is the metaphor to think about in terms of human spirits. So two other passages, Revelation chapter 6, verse 11, talks about people in the third heaven having white robes. Very beginning of verse 11 says, there was given to each of them a white robe, and they were told that they should rest for a little while longer, and so on. So they were given a white robe. And then so too, Revelation chapter 7, verse 9 says, after these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could count, from every nation and all tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes and palm branches and so on. So again, white robes are things being worn by believers in the third heaven. So for a human to be a human spirit must be embodied and joined with some form of vessel, and that is the physical body. It must be clothed with a body. That's the metaphor that the Bible uses, so that's the metaphor we should use too. And so in this, Scripture indirectly teaches a concept that my mentor has termed interim bodies. I'm not sure how standard a theological term that is. That's what Ichthus, the website run by my mentor, calls it. That's the terminology I use too to follow his. But this idea that humans must be embodied, that's just how we are as humans. That's how we're built. So what this is the idea that after we die physically, but before the resurrection, as talked about in 1 Corinthians 15, human spirits of departed believers who were previously in Abraham's bosom before Christ's ascension and now in the third heaven after Christ's ascension are clothed by God in temporary bodies. And so bodies of this sort, what we are calling interim bodies, are both distinct from the sort of body we possess in this life, that is, a fleshly body infested with sin, and the sort of resurrection body, like Christ's, we shall eventually possess in eternity. This would be the so-called spiritual body, and in Greek, that is soma pneumatikon. That is spiritual body. I mean, I think it's actually plural in 1 Corinthians 15:44, like son. Well, I don't know. I have to go check the Greek, but it might be like somata pneumatica would be the plural form of that. But the point is, we will have these spiritual bodies in eternity, like Christ's, separate from the fleshly ones. But in the interim, there will be a body that is like neither of these, what we are going to call the interim body. The sleeves our spirits are put in, the clothing we put on in the interim period. And so to flesh out this topic a little more, one of the reasons why this is very often missed or misunderstood is because of that issue I brought up when we were looking at 1 Corinthians 5, verses 1 through 4. Right, this thing in verse 3 where I said, having put it on, we will not be found naked. It's really more having put off the old physical body. And so my mentor has an explanation of this up on his site in one of the questions and answers. I'm taking a sec to load here. But this is kind of a complicated textual issue. So textual criticism is the art and science of figuring out what the original text of the Bible said, since the Bible was copied and recopied many times over the decades and the centuries. Changes could creep in and corrupt the text. So just as if you or I copy something down, we might misspell something, we might miss a word. That could happen with the Bible as well. So the exact specifics of this particular matter are kind of beyond the scope of what I want to get into here. It's pretty complicated, pretty technical. So again, you can see this link to go kind of read all the gory technical details about this particular issue. But suffice it to say that the proper way to translate 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 3 is actually along the lines of when we are unclothed. Again, here, having put it on, we would say having put it off if you want to use that form of translation. We say when we are unclothed, that is because we have died and our spirits have left our physical bodies, because bodies are the clothing analogy here. So when we are unclothed, that is we have died physically, we will not be found naked. That is because God will clothe our spirits with some new body. So you can see here, inasmuch as we, having put off like our physical bodies, we will not be found naked. And so the difference here in the Greek, I'm going off memory, it didn't look like the link was working. Maybe I don't have internet right now, is that the Greek has prepositions n and x. And so the question here in the prefix is, are we putting it on or taking it off? And so that is the textual matter here. And so the alternative, and this is the way that other translations take it, in fact, most translations translate this way, is saying that when we are clothed, so notice the difference, clothed versus unclothed, we will not be found naked. And so what that means is, well, when we have a body, we will end up not being naked. That is not being out of a body. And so you can kind of see that this second version, one of the other things strengthening the textual argument against it is that it's really tautological. It's like super obvious and repetitive. Like, if we're clothed, we're not naked. Well, okay, that's great. But, like, why would we need to say that? Versus the correct textual form, and again, if you want to see all the details, you can read this link. But the correct textual form is saying something more along the lines of when we become unclothed, that is because we die, we will be clothed by God. That is, God will give us a new body to clothe us. And so, sorry that was a bit technical. I tried to keep some of the details out of it, but to put all of that into plainer English, when you translate 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 3 correctly, it's saying something more like this, that when we put off our present bodies, when we die physically, that is, our spirits leave our physical body, we will not be found naked in the sense of being without a body for our human spirit. Ergo, interim bodies. Like, that's where we get the idea from in Scripture. So it's not just this verse alone that this rests on, although, as I say, this is not understood a lot, primarily because of the textual issue in this verse. So there's also the passage in Luke chapter 16 that we've been thinking about. So if you wanted to say that human beings are somehow not embodied in eternity, or sorry, not in eternity, in the afterlife, well, what about this parable here in Luke chapter 16? Do disembodied spirits have tongues that experience heat? And so the rich man in this parable asks Abraham to let Lazarus dip his finger in water to cool off his tongue, for he is in agony in this flame. Well, how can someone who doesn't have a physical body have a tongue, right? And then, moreover, how could you even recognize Abraham and Lazarus and the rich man if they were just disembodied spirits in Hades? What do spirits look like? How do you tell one from the other? It just doesn't seem like this parable here. And I should be clear, like I've talked about in previous video, that this is literal. It's not just like made up. This is, historical people who actually lived. Abraham was a real person. Jesus doesn't just make up stories using real people. This is a description of something. And so it is actually describing how the afterlife works, how Abraham's bosom works. And so for that reason, how could these people just be disembodied if they're recognizable and they have physical attributes like tongues? So that's indirect evidence too, right? And then you can also compare those verses that we read initially in Revelation chapter 6 and Revelation chapter 7, talking about the white robes that people in the third heaven are wearing. So how can disembodied spirits wear white robes? How does that work? They have to have bodies, but they can't be resurrection bodies because this is early in Revelation. The resurrection hasn't happened yet. So they can't be the resurrection bodies that we were talking about in 1 Corinthians 15 because that hasn't happened yet. So They're not alive, they're not in the world, they don't have their physical bodies, but they don't have resurrection bodies, but they have to have bodies because they're wearing robes, ergo interim bodies. So that's where we're getting it from in Scripture. Now, in closing off this introduction of this teaching, I should be real clear that there's a lot we don't know here. So I'm just going to go ahead and quote something from my mentor's website. He has a question and answer up on interim bodies. And so almost, I'm just going to go ahead and read the quote off his site. But this is describing these things that we're talking about, these bodies that we have in between when we die physically and the resurrection, the bodies that we have in between interim bodies, but we just don't know a lot about them. And so my mentor says this: we have very little to go on when it comes to the constitution of the interim body, just the passages I cited previously. So that is 2 Corinthians 5:3, which has the textual issue we talked about, and then the two passages from Revelation talking about the white robes. So picking back up in his quote, Revelation calls it a white sheet to wear. 2 Corinthians also uses the clothing analogy, saying that we, quote unquote, won't be found naked. And in Luke 16, both those in paradise and those in torments are recognizable, can speak, reason, and seemingly function in most important ways, just as we presently can. Were I to speculate, I would say that the materiality or physicality of the interim body is less pronounced than the other two. And so we know that we can eat in both the natural and revelation bodies. There's a quotation from Luke chapter 24 here, which is, when Jesus appears to them, he ate this piece of broiled fish before them. He was physical, he ate the fish. So we can eat in both the natural and resurrection bodies, but there is neither need nor probably opportunity to eat in the interim state, whether it be paradise of the past or the third heaven of the present. And I would imagine that this is true of much of the physical interaction, which is commonplace now and will be again after the resurrection. Then again, the rich man asked Abraham to have Lazarus dip the tip of his finger in water to cool his tongue. It doesn't happen, but it may be that he was observing, eating, and drinking across the great fixed gulf of Luke chapter 16, verse 26. I can't say for sure. So again, this is my mentor on the concept of interim bodies, and there's just a lot that we don't know for sure. It is plausible even, that maybe they aren't quite as physical, so to speak, as the bodies we presently have in the resurrection bodies, but even that we really can't say with certainty because we just don't have a lot on this from the Bible. We know that they are bodies because human beings have bodies, because we are composed of body and spirit. We know that they can wear things because the people in the third heaven in Revelation 6:11 and 7:9 have white robes that they wear. And we know that 2 Corinthians 5:3, when you translate it using the correct text, vis-a-vis textual criticism, teaches that when we become unclothed because we die, we will not be found naked. That is, we will have a body. Well, all of these things teach it, but we just don't know very much past that. So we will be embodied in the afterlife, even before the resurrection. But what exactly that means, we just shouldn't teach too much dogmatically on it because we just don't know from Scripture. And that's kind of like the point to end on here in emphasis, is just that we shouldn't go past what the Bible teaches on this. And again, it's not as direct a teaching as some other things, as you can see here, just a few verses, but the concept is clearly there by inference that when we die, we will still have bodies in the afterlife, even before the resurrection. Yeah, even before the resurrection. They will just be interim bodies rather than resurrection bodies. All right, so with that, we are finally ready to answer that question of what happens after physical death in the normal case. So if you remember back, we said that we were going to try to answer, like what happens when people die in the normal case before we try to handle, well, what happens when people die right before they're resuscitated? Like what's the difference there? Well, before we're going to get to that second case, we need to talk about what is the normal state of affairs for people who aren't resuscitated. And so assuming we're talking about a believer here, which, Lazarus presumably was, and we don't actually know so much about Jairus' daughter, but probably so. Well, before Christ's ascension, they would have ended up in Abraham's bosom in Hades, or in the paradise in Hades, in an interim body. And so this is before Christ's ascension, as described in Ephesians chapter 4. Now, after Christ's ascension, they will end up in the third heaven in an interim body still. This is in the presence of God the Father. And so in both these cases, this is after they died physically, but before the resurrection, they end up in interim bodies. It's just a matter of where. Before the cross, before the ascension of Christ, the pre-cross believers were in Abraham's bosom, and after Christ's ascension, now when people die, they go immediately to the presence of the Father in the third heaven. But in both cases, they still have these temporary bodies that they're in until the resurrection. And then finally, after the resurrection, each person shall possess a resurrection body just like Christ's body after he was resurrected. That's the soma pneumatikon of 1 Corinthians 15, verse 44. This is the spiritual body that we will possess in eternity. And so this is, quote unquote, what happens after you die. This is in all the details, and hopefully now we know what all of this means. We know what we mean by before and after Christ's ascension. We know what Abraham's bosom is. We know what Hades is. We know what an interim body is. We know what the resurrection body is, because we read that whole passage in 1 Corinthians 15. All of this, hopefully, based on all of that background work we did, even though it's just several sentences here, you can see that this entire, I'm quite sure we're over an hour now, this long video has been going over all of the terms that we use here to talk about, well, what happens after we die. So this is the normal case. This is what happens when a person who is a believer dies physically. And so finally, we're going to get to the point of this whole video was to answer the question about, well, what about those people who are resuscitated? Is their afterlife experience any different? And so put differently, matters of the afterlife are no different when it comes to people who are resuscitated, except they go backwards from the interim body to the physical world, in addition to the normal forward version of that passage, whereas others only ever make that transition in the forward direction alone. That is, most people, when they die, they go from this world to Hades and never back to the world again. So I'm going to go look at our pictures, since pictures are helpful. So most people, when they die, they leave here, they leave this cosmos, the devil's world, and they go here. And then after, well, okay, so this would be before Christ's ascension. They would leave here, go here. After Christ's ascension, they leave here, they go here. But people who are resuscitated, again, before Christ's ascension, they would go from here to here, they end up in Hades, and then they're resuscitated, and they go back here. So most people only go this direction. Those people go from the cosmos to Hades, back to the cosmos, versus most people just go from the cosmos to Hades, and then that's it. They will not be resuscitated. That's where they will be until the resurrection. And so that's the only difference here, is that most people only go forwards, but those who are resuscitated go backwards too. But they only do that once, really, because once they make that transition a second time, that is, they die a second time after being resuscitated, it's really as if there were nothing irregular about their afterlife experience at all. And so we're going to use Jairus' daughter as an example here. And so, assuming for the sake of argument that she met the standards of belief necessary for salvation at the time of Matthew 9, not going to get into that too much either, but basically what we believe now after Jesus came and died and was resurrected, what we have to believe to be saved, it's not quite the same as what pre-cross believers did, because there wasn't as much revelation at that point. God's like epistemological standards, if you want to use jargon, would be different for people. But let's assume, for the sake of this argument, that Jairus was a leader of the Jews and that he was teaching his family to believe, and further that his daughter was actually past the age where she had moral like accountability. It's not like a specific age for children, depends on the person, but like let's say she was old enough that that was true, but that she did believe. Well, all that out of the way, let's say that Jairus' daughter would be saved. Like that's the short version here. Well, then when she died, she would have found herself in Abraham's bosom in an interim body until her human spirit was called back to her physical fleshly body here in the world, at which point the interim body in Abraham's bosom would have no longer been necessary. But we don't really know what happens to it. Like, did it get recycled, so to speak? Or, well, we don't know. No idea. Again, we just don't know very much about interim bodies. But point is, she died, she went to Abraham's bosom, she was in an interim body, she gets called back when she's resuscitated, the interim body is no longer necessary, and now her human spirit is joined with her physical body in the world again. But then, after she lived out the remainder of her days, she would once again have died physically, because that happens to everyone who's resuscitated. They don't live forever after they're resuscitated, they die again. And so after all this, she would have once again died physically, and if she was still a believer at that point in time, she would have again found herself in an interim body in the afterlife. Although probably now in the third heaven, since she probably would have died long after Jesus had ascended because she was so young at the time of his ministry. So Luke chapter, I forget which chapter it is, Luke chapter 12 maybe? I don't remember exactly where this parable is in Luke, but Luke says she's about 12 when this happens. And so, if she was 12 and Jesus does this early on in his ministry, Jesus' ministry was 3 years long. We don't know exactly the dates, but plus or minus a couple years here. Well, Jesus would have probably been died and resurrected and ascended before she was 15 for sure. And so if this happened and she lived a normal lifespan, for that time period, maybe 50, 60 years, then she probably would have died decades after Jesus' ascension. And so all that to say, if she was still a believer at that time, because only believers are saved, then she would go to the third heaven, but in an interim body. So vis-a-vis the initial question here, the point is, when people who are resuscitated die, they go to the same place that everyone else who dies normally does. The only difference is that they go backwards too, at least once, so they go from either Abraham's bosom before the ascension or the third heaven after the ascension, back to their physical body. They live out the rest of their days. They die again. They go back into an interim body to wait for the resurrection, just like the rest of us. So that is how all this works for those who are resuscitated. And so I hope this video has been helpful. I'm sure it has been quite a lot to take in. But nonetheless, now that we've been through all of this, hopefully what we say here makes sense, talking about human spirits and interim bodies and Abraham's bosom and all that. We've hopefully gone through enough that when you have to explain this and think about it in your head, all of what we have said here kind of comes together to give us that full picture of what happens when people die, and the fact that those who are resuscitated, they have kind of this strange transition when they go backwards from Hades or the third heaven back to the cosmos, and then they die again and then end up in an interim body a second time. Well, hopefully all of this kind of makes sense in context with everything that we've talked about here in this lesson. All right, finally, to pull it all together, because this has been a long one, just talking over the outline of what we've gone over. So we introduced that question of, well, does resuscitation mean that people's afterlife experience is any different than people who aren't resuscitated? That is kind of what we were setting out to answer here. But before we could even get to that, we had to give an awful lot of background information. We talked about the nature and composition of human beings, how we are dichotomous body and spirit. We talked about the 3 types of death: physical, spiritual, and eternal death, and how we are specifically focusing on physical death in these questions here. We talked about how physical death means someone's human spirit leaves their physical body. And so breath and spirit are the same words in Greek and Hebrew. So nephesh in Hebrew and that's soul. Ruach in Hebrew and pneuma in Greek mean breath and spirit. And so we talked about how when people die, they no longer breathe, and that's the association there. We talked about, well, what happens after people die? Well, where do they go? We had to explain heavenly geography and the third heaven and Satan's cosmos, the world system we now inhabit, and Hades or Sheol or the grave or the underworld, which is where all the other subdivisions are, and then how those are separated by the waters above and the waters below, like the sea of glass mentioned in the book of Revelation. And so that's heavenly geography. That's where we go when we die, so to speak. And then we talk about how that's actually different for believers before and after Christ's ascension, although in both cases, unbelievers still go to torments to await the great white throne judgment, at which point they'll end up in the lake of fire. And then that's eternity proper. So in eternity proper, believers end up having perfect fellowship with each other and God and elect angels in the new heavens and the new earth. While unbelievers and Satan and the other fallen angels end up in the lake of fire. And to close out our background discussion, we talked about interim bodies. And so this idea that after we die physically, we're no longer in our physical bodies here in the world, But before we get the resurrection bodies of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, we are in what we're going to call interim bodies, these temporary bodies that God gives us so that we will not be found naked. As 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 3 says, if you translate it from the right text, you do the textual criticism to get to the right textual base. And so then after all that, we said that, well, what happens after you die physically in the normal case? Well, for normal folks, they go from the physical world either to Abraham's bosom or the third heaven, depending on if Christ had ascended at this point, like when they died. And then the only difference in the case of those people who are resuscitated is that they go backwards once. They make that transition in the reverse direction until they die a second time, in which case it's permanent. Then it's as if their experience is no different than anyone else's in the afterlife. So I hope this was helpful. An awful lot of information here, but hopefully this helps explain the afterlife and what we believe as Christians. Like, what does the Bible teach about when we die? Where do we go? What happens? How are we? What will we experience when all of this happens? And so, long video here, but good stuff talking about these topics of death and resurrection and what we believe on these matters as Christians.